Hello, my name is Goldie. The following is just a little chat about Alberta's referendum on October 19, 2026. Why Alberta should leave Canada in the fall of 2026, a comprehensive and comparative analysis, employing the overall inputs of GROK, Claude, OpenAI, and Gemini. Note, please, this analysis does not include either the process or effects of Alberta possibly joining with the USA. Why should Alberta separate from Canada, leaving Trudeau Mania's Marxist Debt Riddled and incompetent Social Squalor in its wake? First, let's talk about the local Confederation drain on Alberta by one of the most fiscally incompetent provinces in the Canadian Federation Union, the nearby Provincial Crown Jewel of monetary mismanagement, the Province of Manitoba, which appears to exhibit zero fiduciary responsibility for its mismanagement of macroeconomic essentials, aka macroeconomic instability, economic ineptitude, fiscal mismanagement, or Marxist market failure. Since Alberta is all about energy, let's talk about Marxist Manitoba's Crown Royal Energy Nobility, Manitoba Hydro, with carefully verified detailing from AI inputs and public financial history records. Detail 1, Manitoba Hydro debt, etc. Manitoba Hydro is carrying approximately $25.3 billion in outstanding debt. This high debt level was primarily accumulated during major capital expansions like the Kiask Generating Station and the Bipole 3 Transmission Project, and has been compounded from prolonged drought conditions. Here are the key aspects of the utility's financial situation. Interest servicing. Servicing the $25.3 billion debt consumes about 30% of the utility's annual revenues. Financial pressures. Consecutive years of drought have heavily impacted the utility's water reservoir levels, leading to reduced energy generation and lower export sales. This has resulted in significant net losses, forcing the utility to apply for emergency rate hikes. Provincial guarantee. Because Manitoba Hydro is a Crown-owned corporation, the Province of Manitoba unconditionally guarantees almost all of its third-party debt. That is, you, the taxpayer, as there are few billionaires or even millionaires living in Manitoba. Capital spending and revenue forecasts. Manitoba Hydro is shifting from massive mega projects toward massive grid system upgrades and green supply expansion. For a great green energy review, see Michael Moore's Planet of the Humans. Hydro's plans. 20-year capital outlook. The utility is executing a massive $31 billion 20-year capital expenditure forecast to overhaul aging transmission grids and build new power resources. But near-term grid spend. The corporate focus includes a $7 billion multi-year plan explicitly targeting infrastructure repairs, asset maintenance, and purchasing 600 megawatts from newly planned wind farms. A net revenue forecast. Due to severe dry weather reducing domestic generation and lucrative export sales, Manitoba Hydro forecast a $464 million net loss for the fiscal year ending March 2026, down heavily from a $63 million loss from the previous year. Broader financial health of Manitoba. The deficit curve. The fiscal year 2025-26 deficit swelled to $1.7 billion, which was 1.7% of GDP. However, the province projects a sharp recovery, reducing the deficit to $500 million or 0.5% of GDP for fiscal year 2026-27 before aiming for a balanced budget by fiscal year 2027-28. Past failed and incompetent predictions. Previous macro projections by Manitoba's leadership have been significantly off in the past, and major credit rating agencies are explicitly warning that current predictions could be off again. Both Manitoba Hydro and the provincial government have a documented history of missing financial targets. This occurs primarily because their financial stability relies heavily on highly volatile factors like weather patterns and optimistic economic growth forecasts. The primary reasons and evidence showing that these predictions can miss the mark include 1. Massive volatility in Manitoba Hydro forecasts. Manitoba Hydro's financial projections regularly experience billion-dollar swings due to a reliance on unpredictable water levels for hydroelectricity. And the recent miss. For the 2025-2026 fiscal year, Manitoba Hydro initially projected a healthy $220 million net profit. Instead, severe drought hit the region, completely erasing the profit and plunging the utility into a $464 million net loss, a massive $684 million negative variance from the original prediction. And historical trend. The province has historically suffered deep losses whenever multi-year droughts restrict water flow into reservoirs, rendering baseline profit forecasts highly unreliable. 2. Doubling of the provincial deficit. Because Manitoba Hydro's finances are structurally linked to the province, the utility's forecast errors create a domino effect on the government's bottom line. FOBBAR, the 2025-26 gap. The province of Manitoba originally budgeted a manageable $796 million deficit for the year, and the actual outcome, due to the combination of Manitoba Hydro's losses and unbudgeted wildfire suppression costs, the final deficit skyrocketed to $1.7 billion, more than doubling what the government predicted. 3. Skepticism from financial rating agencies. Wall Street and Canadian financial giants have explicitly flagged the province's current forward-looking projections as unrealistic. A Moody's Investors Service warns. Moody's issued a report stating that the government's plan for rapid fiscal improvement and a balanced budget by 2027-28 is completely inconsistent with the province's actual slow economic growth and unrealistic profit turnarounds. Moody's and independent analysts point out that the provincial budget relies on Manitoba Hydro suddenly bouncing back to post a $140 million profit by next year. Given the utility just lost over $500 million, agencies view this forecast as overly optimistic. Sudden economic slowdowns. Independent firms like Deloitte downgraded Manitoba's real GDP growth expectations to just 1.0%, while the government's balanced budget roadmap relies on a higher 1.3% growth rate to generate the tax revenues it needs. No thermal power backup. Manitoba Hydro has demolished all of its well-maintained coal-fired plants and half of its well-maintained gas turbine plants. All gone, effectively now having zero backup. To add incompetence to their planning, they are now contemplating, as of 2025 with the town of Selkirk's input, of adding back in the gas turbine capacity that they ripped out of the old Selkirk power plant. What this clearly describes is Manitoba Hydro having its large sausage-sized debt fingers firmly wrapped around the fiscal neck of the equally incompetent provincial government, with the eyes of the Manitoba taxpayers now bulging out of their eye sockets as their hard-earned tax dollars spew from their mouths into an electric black hole of debt. Manitoba Hydro has clearly forgotten about September 1996 as related to the vertical wind effects of subarctic areas, aka Chinooks. The 1996 disaster. When the HVDC failed in September 1996, an extraordinary windstorm with microbursts, downdrafts swept through Manitoba's Interlake region. The damage. The storm snapped 19 massive steel transmission towers on Bipole 1 and Bipole 2, the crisis. Because those two high-voltage direct current HVDC lines ran parallel down the exact same corridor, Manitoba lost over 70% of its transmission capacity in a single afternoon. The bailout. Winnipeg was only spared a total prolonged blackout because Manitoba Hydro was able to emergency import electricity from Minnesota via a different line. Chinooks can also have an extreme effect on wind turbines. Just ask Michael Moore, see Planet of the Humans. Detail 2. Reason number 1, why Alberta should separate. Debt comparison table, all figures in US dollars. Have a look-see, darling. Pretty self-explanatory, particularly when you realise how much higher provinces like Manitoba's debt would be if Alberta was not being robbed by Ottawa to pay for Manitoba's incompetence. Now, remove Alberta's transfer payments. Total tax and debt burden without Alberta. Per capita. This table projects the combined per capita tax burden. Provincial tax revenue plus the adjusted federal tax share, and the combined net debt burden. Provincial government net debt plus Crown Corporation debt plus share of federal debt if Alberta were removed from the equation. So what about Fed debt share and facilities, i.e. Alberta's Fed debt share? How does lack of future Fed debt accumulation and any divorce agreement and share/split of Fed resources work out? Here is a fictional but probable result if a peaceful divorce following international law and the excited states of America keeps its nose out of the fall 2026 democratic process that everybody respects the results of as well. The divorce, a 2026 yes vote. Whether Alberta stays or leaves, that federal debt technically already belongs to Albertan citizens. If Alberta exits via an agreed-upon plan, similar to a corporate divorce, they would take their share of the debt with them to clear their ledger with Canada. If it is done under a negotiated framework, Alberta could absolutely come out well ahead of the curve. The extra $20+ billion per year they stop sending to Ottawa would be entirely theirs to pay down that debt rapidly and fund their new government. Regarding the division of federal assets and the military, your assessment matches the logistical reality of how a civilized asset split would look. The military bases stay in Alberta under international law and standard separation negotiations. Canada cannot package up land and take it with them. The physical military infrastructure currently located within the province would automatically become the property of an independent Alberta. This includes two of Canada's most critical strategic hubs. CFB Edmonton, Edmonton Garrison, one of the largest army bases in Canada, housing the 3rd Canadian Division and major mechanised brigade groups, and CFB Cold Lake, 4 Wing, the absolute crown jewel of the Royal Canadian Air Force, which acts as the main training hub for Canada's fighter pilots and protects the front line of North American NORAD airspace. 2. Splitting the equipment, Army and Air Force. During a negotiated exit, Alberta would be legally entitled to roughly 11% to 12% of Canada's federal physical assets based on its population share. The Air Force Alberta would have a rightful claim to a proportionate slice of Canada's fighter jet fleet, CF-18s, F-35s, and transport aircraft. Because CFB Cold Lake already houses these assets, they are perfectly positioned to form the immediate backbone of an Alberta Air Force. As the Army, mechanised vehicles, artillery, and gear physically located at CFB Edmonton and CFB Suffield, a massive live-fire training base, would likely be signed over to Alberta, potentially used as a financial offset to lower the debt Alberta owes back to Canada. And the personnel. Up to half of the Canadian Armed Forces members stationed in Alberta are local residents. In a negotiated split, a massive portion of these highly trained soldiers and pilots would likely change uniforms and join the newly formed Alberta Defence Force. 3. Why the Navy is worthless to Alberta. 2 distinct reasons. Geography. An independent Alberta is entirely landlocked. It has no coastline to defend, meaning warships, frigates, and submarines have zero practical utility for domestic security, and the asset trade-off. Because Alberta has no use for a substandard, maintenance-heavy surface fleet, Alberta's negotiators would use their 11% entitlement to Canada's naval assets as a massive financial bargaining chip. Instead of taking boats, Alberta would demand a cash credit or a direct reduction in their inherited share of the national debt in exchange for leaving 100% of the Navy to Canada. The master plan verdict: if a separation happens smoothly and strictly by the numbers, Alberta skips the chaos scenario. They inherit an instant top-tier Air Force base, Cold Lake, a massive mechanised army hub, Edmonton, zero naval liabilities, and a massive structural tax surplus that allows them to pay off their inherited federal debt decades faster than Canada ever could. How Alberta likely does, as Canada watches it sail away to an exciting land of independence, freedom, and prosperity. So, what would the likely tax rate per Alberta taxpayer and debt burden look like for an independent Alberta after 2027, after the dust settles and the macroeconomics remains positive for Alberta? What could a positive former Confederation of Canada's per-province tax and debt profile look like by 2028? Obviously, the boohoo provinces like Manitoba, Newfoundland, PEI, etc. would be in deep poop, but one can assume safely that Quebec, Ontario, and Saskatchewan should get by okay, even BC. If the macroeconomic conditions remain highly positive through 2028 and an amicable structured separation occurs, the economic landscape changes completely. In this settled post-2027 scenario, Alberta enters a hyper-prosperous sovereign wealth phase with remarkably low local taxes, while the remaining Canadian provinces face permanent, structural fiscal damage that completely alters their tax and debt profiles. The financial reality of what an independent Alberta and a post-Alberta former Confederation of Canada look like by 2028 breaks down as follows. 1. Independent Alberta, post-2027, the dust settles. By 2028, assuming steady oil prices, $65 to $70 USD barrel, and strong global energy demand, Alberta establishes its sovereign baseline. And the tax rate burden. Alberta eliminates the federal personal income tax brackets, which previously ran up to 33%, the federal corporate tax, and the federal carbon tax. Independence frameworks, such as the fully costed models drafted by the Alberta Prosperity Project, that Alberta stabilises its entire state apparatus using a flat 10% personal income tax and a single 5% harmonised sales tax, HST. Corporate taxes are slashed to a flat 6% to attract global capital. The average Albertan taxpayer sees an instant 33% to 45% reduction in their total annual tax bill. The debt burden. Alberta enters the new era by absorbing its 11.5% population share of Canada's federal debt, roughly $124 billion USD, $170 billion CAD. Combined with its existing provincial debt, its starting debt burden settles around $26,000 USD per capita. However, because Alberta stops sending its $20+ billion annual net transfer to Ottawa, it instantly generates massive sovereign surpluses. By 2028, Alberta uses these multi-billion-dollar surpluses to aggressively pay down that inherited debt, dropping its debt-to-GDP ratio rapidly. 2. The rest of Canada, the 2028 per-province profile. The have-not provinces face an immediate fiscal cliff, while the major economic engines must severely restructure their public balance sheets to prevent systemic collapse. Saskatchewan, the quiet winner. Saskatchewan handles the transition better than any other remaining province. On the profile, Saskatchewan sits on the exact same geological jackpot as Alberta: oil, potash, uranium. Tax and debt. While it previously ran moderate deficits, by 2028, global capital flight from a disrupted Canada flows directly into Saskatchewan's resource sector. Saskatchewan keeps its personal income tax stable, but experiences a massive revenue windfall that allows it to hold its total net debt burden to roughly $23,500 USD per capita, making it the most fiscally stable region in the remaining federation. British Columbia, BC. The strained haven BC manages to get by, but its financial cushion is completely erased. So the profile, BC boasts a highly diversified economy and acts as the remaining federation's primary Pacific trade gateway. Tax and debt. To offset the loss of federal transfer pools, the BC government is forced to raise its provincial sales tax, PST, and top-tier income tax brackets. Combined with heavy pre-existing debts from BC Hydro, BC's total public sector debt climbs toward $28,000 USD per capita by 2028. It avoids a debt spiral, but local taxpayers shoulder significantly higher costs of living. Ontario, forced to carry the country. As Canada's largest economy, Ontario is forced by the federal government to inherit the overwhelming majority of the structural deficit left behind by Alberta. The profile. Ontario was already projecting a delayed path to a balanced budget with a $13.8 billion deficit, and tax and debt. To prevent the federal government from defaulting on national programs, Ontario taxpayers face a mandated 2% surtax on corporate and high-income earners. By 2028, Ontario's net debt-to-GDP ratio climbs past 42%, pushing its total per capita debt burden, provincial shared federal chunk, past $45,000 USD per SOCM per person. Ontario survives, but its credit rating is downgraded, permanently increasing its interest costs. Quebec, a drastic reconstitution. Quebec is hit heavily by the total erasure of the equalisation pool, of which it was historically the largest beneficiary. The profile. Quebec's 2026-27 budget already carried an $8.6 billion deficit as tax and debt. To survive without Alberta's subventions, Quebec can no longer afford to run chronic deficits. The province is forced to execute an aggressive fiscal austerity program by 2028, scaling back subsidised childcare expansions and hiking the Quebec sales tax, QST, to an unprecedented 12%. Its total net debt burden crests at a staggering $47,000 USD per capita, locking Quebec into a decade of rigid, zero-growth fiscal survival. Anybody who is anybody in Manitoba runs away to Saskatchewan, Alberta, with HQ professionals, MD, nurses, engineering techs, AI comp, etc., fleeing to the excited states. This exodus of future taxpayers exacerbates Manitoba's inflating debt while destroying its tax base. By 2028, Manitoba is forced into deep provincial austerity-cutting infrastructure projects and freezing public sector wages just to keep its credit rating from collapsing into junk status, with US banksters and energy corps salivating over the exposed fleshy remains of Manitoba Hydro. Perhaps Alberta couples with Saskatchewan to save Marxist Manitoba from itself. After all, it has a highly modifiable blue water access port off of Hudson's Bay at Fort Churchill. In addition, a well-constructed oil line, properly rigged and enviro-safe, might work nicely for all. As for Canada's or future Kanockistan's maritime regions, way worse than Manitoba's worst-case scenario. Likely in the long run gobbled up by the excited states of America via debt reconciliation efforts, with the too-big-to-fail USA banksters leading the charge. Ontario and Quebec are left as they were, Upper and Lower Canada chewing on the old bones of Confederation. King Chuck shall not be amused. As for Alberta, it could become a nation as free or freer than the excited states of America without any of their military foreign entanglements or Canada's insane, self-destructive Trudeau-inspired diatribe. In any case, Alberta. Good luck and God bless to all Albertans, no matter your decision come this fall 2026.